The way we define air pollution is a heterogeneous mixture of gases and aerosols. Maybe I should define what an aerosol is. An
Hmm.
aerosol is a solid or liquid particle suspended in a gas. So in this case, we're talking about our atmosphere. So that's what we mean by air pollution. And it is specifically compounds, either gaseous or found in the particles, that have adverse impacts on the environment or human health.
Welcome everybody to the 63rd episode of the Struggling Scientist podcast. We are a podcast by scientists, for scientists, anybody science adjacent, and perhaps even hobbyists. My name is Susanne and I'm here with my co-host Jaron.
Hi.
The topic for today's episode is air pollution, a very interesting topic that is of course getting more and more relevant. We're going to talk with Dr. David Gonzalez, an atmospheric scientist who is now a postdoctoral scholar in an environmental cardiology and vascular biology lab. We hope to learn a lot about the science behind air pollution today, so let's start. Welcome, David. We're so happy to have you on our podcast today.
Thank you so much, Suzanne and Jaren. Happy to be here. I just also want to say congrats to Jaren again for finishing his PhD. Congrats, doctor.
Thank you.
Yes. So before we get started with our very interesting topic, we would love to know a little bit more about you. Could you introduce yourself to our listeners? Who are you? Where are you from? What is your expertise? And do you have any interesting hobbies?
Oh, yeah, sure thing. So my name is David Gonzalez. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. And I was born in Monterrey, Mexico, but I grew up in the United States. I spent my childhood in South Texas, right on the border, a town called Far. That's Far with a PH and two R's. In the Rio Grande Valley region of Texas. And in my teenage years, I spent in a rural area outside of Houston, Southeast Texas, where I graduated high school. And after that, moved to Southern California, where I enrolled in community college and transferred to UCLA. Been here ever since, did a bachelor's degree in chemistry, then transitioned and did a master's and PhD in atmospheric and oceanic sciences, where I focused on atmospheric chemistry of air pollution particles, and took the bold move after that to do a postdoc in cardiology, focusing on air pollution toxicology. So my expertise is in the chemistry of particulate matter and air pollution toxicology. In terms of interesting hobbies, so I'd say my absolute favorite thing to do is music, listening to music, playing music. I play guitar and bass guitar, compose my own music. So these days, after a long day in the lab, you might find me at open mics or whatever gigs I can find in the Los Angeles area, and just say that nothing brings me more joy than music. So it's a nice balance to academia.
Yes. Always great to be creative next to it.
Absolutely.
Do you have any songs that you've made yourself?
Yeah. I have 8 original compositions, actually, that I'm in the process with a friend and trying to record and kind of make somewhat of an album or EP,
Cool.
Yeah, so I'm excited about that.
Do they fall under a specific genre, or do they span a lot of different genres?
Yeah, they span a little bit. So I'd say it's the most familiar sound, I think, to listeners would be flamenco, Mexican folk inspired, and there's just a dash of rock and heavy metal influence in there. So a little experimental, but I have
Nice.
fun.
Nice.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe delving back into our original topic of the episode. So since our topic is air pollution, can you maybe provide our listeners a clear description of what air pollution actually is and why it's important?
Sure. Yeah. So the way we define air pollution is a heterogeneous mixture of gases and aerosols. Maybe I should define what an aerosol is. An aerosol is a solid or liquid particle suspended in a gas. So in this case, we're talking about our atmosphere. So that's what we mean by air pollution. And it is specifically compounds, either gaseous or found in the particles, that have adverse impacts on the environment or human health.
Are there any examples that you can list for us?
Sure, yeah. So probably the most common type of air pollution that people encounter in urban areas, like smog, so vehicle emissions. And these days, as wildfires are on the uptick, wildfire smoke. that's a type of air pollution that I think people are probably most familiar with.
Mm.
Right. And what are the primary sources of air pollution? And how do they impact our environment and our health?
Sure. So combustion sources from vehicles are one of the major sources of air pollution, as well as industrial processes, depending on where you're at.
Mm.
Wildfire, whether they are started by people or naturally caused, are really major sources of air pollution. We call those primary sources of air pollution because they emit, or I should say, primary sources of particles because they emit particles directly into the atmosphere. There's also something called secondary sources of particles, and that is gas compounds that are released either from vehicles, combustion, maybe a can of paint thinner you have in your garage that can go into the atmosphere and react with sunlight, do some photochemistry, and the gas molecules will form particles in the air. And so we call that a secondary source of particulate matter.
Hmm.
So is it also that then the concentration of the particulate matter in the air is really important, or is for defining it as air pollution, or is it just the moment that particulate is in the air, it's air pollution?
Yeah, so regardless of the concentration, once it's in the air, it's a pollutant.
Mm.
But you touch on an important point from a toxicological perspective. The famous line is the dose makes the poison. So the higher the concentration, the more likely you are to have health impacts. In terms of environmental impacts, one of the things that really intense air pollution episodes can have is impact visibility. And so this can cause issues for people who are driving. People who are driving airplanes also can face issues, because it's hard to see if you're driving through a wildfire plume or just really thick smog.
Okay. Can you tell us maybe a little bit about the current state of air pollution, what it's like globally? Is it getting better or worse? Are there really big regional differences? Something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say in the developing world, it's a huge problem. And places like India and China, parts of China experience these really bad air pollution episodes, whereas in places like Los Angeles, which has a notorious history of air pollution and smog, it's actually gotten a lot better since 1943 when the first smog episode occurred. And part of that is due to intervention in Los Angeles and the United States with vehicles. So the primary driver of smog in LA are vehicle emissions, and the introduction of the catalytic converter, as well as regulations that require certain things on the car to be cleaner, have actually led to a decline, a dramatic decline in air pollution, despite an increase in vehicles on the road and population. So it's really kind of a dual thing. Certain places it's gotten a lot better. Other places it's emerging as a big issue.
Do you think we should be worried about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a big problem, primarily because you have the CO2 emissions, which contribute to climate change. But additionally, when we're talking about urban air pollution or particulate matter, those kind of things, it has such a dramatic impact on human health to the point where it becomes an environmental justice issue. It's mostly underserved communities, children, and elderly people that are most impacted by these effects. So it's truly something that I think as humans we should care about.
Yes. And what are some of the available treatments or interventions for people who live in areas with relatively high air pollution?
Sure. So indoors, and I think this is something that maybe caught a little bit of traction during the COVID-19 pandemic. HEPA filters, like HEPA filter fans indoors, are something that can really effectively filter out particles, although they won't filter out the gas compounds. And I should mention an important thing about those indoor filters is they should be used without an ionizing, component to it. So some of these companies sell these HEPA filters, these air filters with an ionizing component that the idea is it decontaminates bacteria or viruses or something. But the problem with that is it usually uses a UV light source, which can create ozone in your local, atmosphere. Ozone's not great to breathe in. Some of them use hydrogen peroxide, also not a great compound to breathe in your home. So there's that one caveat. I'd say indoors, that's the best intervention. In terms of people who are outdoors, N95 masks that are well fitted can filter out the particles really well. But again, that doesn't do it for the gas compounds. Although I will say that the component of air pollution that's most strongly linked to adverse health impacts are the small particles. So it's really the component that we focus on in our lab.
And what do you think are the most important ways to target air pollution to try to reduce it for people in general? What are sort of the major components to,
Yeah, so I think in urban areas, vehicle emissions are the most important contributor. And so we have seen decline due to these both policy and technological interventions. Although it gets tricky in different places because of various cultural or socioeconomic impacts, where maybe those regulations or those interventions don't work in that region. And so that's kind of from the urban air pollution perspective. It gets a little trickier with the climate issue when we talk about climate induced or climate increases of wildfires. That's something that's going to keep happening. And I don't have a good answer for how we mitigate, this uptick in wildfires that, are going to be impacting the world as we go forward. And it's something that's an active area of research. I think some of it's land use management to try to, reduce the area that can be burned, more resources to firefighting and fire mitigation, I think are some of the tools that are being looked at going forward.
What are the common misconceptions that you find people have about air pollution?
Yes, that's a really interesting question. I want to mention two. So first, air pollution, they're pollutants that, can be bad for the environment, but aren't necessarily toxic. So for example, CO2. CO2 at the concentrations we experience in the atmosphere are not toxic to humans, but it does have an impact on the climate. Similarly with chlorofluorocarbons, which are less of an issue these days, a very potent greenhouse gas, deplete the ozone layer, but are actually non-toxic. And that was actually one of the appeals of those human-made compounds early on, was that they were non-toxic and used as refrigerants. And then found out that, well, actually, really, really strong greenhouse gases and deplete the ozone layer. So there's kind of two different types of air pollutants, sort of the climate and the ozone depleting pollutants, and then the pollutants that are toxic to us and plants and animals for that matter.
But so do you think that is it just a matter of informing people more about this to sort of combat that misconception, or do we need to do something else, for example?
Yeah, I think information is a big informing the public is a big part of it, because that informs or can influence policymakers, and policymakers really have a big role in how to deal with this. I mean, we can do all the research and science in the world to say this is what's bad, this is how we get around it. But if policymakers don't enact things that change that, then we're just kind of stuck. So I think, informing policymakers, but also informing the public, so the public is informed and they can make decisions, whether they're voting or they're calling their representatives, is a huge component of it.
Do you know of any emerging research findings or studies in the field of air pollution that our listeners should really know about now, if they want to know more about air pollution after this podcast episode?
Sure. So I think I mentioned that there are two misconceptions, and the second misconception I should have mentioned relates to this. So I think most people, when they think of inhaling air pollution, they think lungs. This is something that impacts the lungs. But it's well known in the field that actually most of the adverse health impacts from air pollution are actually cardiovascular in nature. And that was something that was quite a surprise to me when I started making the transition to air pollution toxicology. So on that note, some of the emerging research, it's partially coming from our lab, is that really tiny particles. So we have particles we call PM2.5 or fine particles, which are particles 2.5 microns and smaller. Those are the ones that really are most strongly linked to health impacts. But a study from our lab in 2008 showed that ultrafine particles, which are particles 0.1 microns and smaller, 100 nanometers, actually induce or promote plaque buildup more so than these 2.5 micron particles. And so now that's something that we're looking at more closely. Why do the smaller particles have more toxicity? Additionally to that, a lot of biomed people have started to get involved in this kind of research. And I think one of the interesting things that have come out of that is that these particles can sort of disrupt the balance of gut bacteria, and that can lead to cardiovascular impacts. So sort of, I feel like gut bacteria and probiotics are like, buzzwords these days. And it's something that we're actively looking at. Can changes in gut bacteria induced by air pollution exposure cause effects in the lungs or the heart? So I think that's very interesting.
No, for sure.
Yeah. So a bit of an out of the box question, but we have a lot of things to worry about, of course, with plastic in the oceans and climate change and the oceans warming up. Where on the scale do you think this lies, or do you think it's all too interconnected to be able to say that?
Yeah, I'd say it's because of the climate issue, it's all interconnected. But I do think that air pollution exposure, air pollution toxicity is something we should really be concerned about because it impacts what I think is, what many people would say is the most precious thing in this world, which is human life. So the most recent global burden of disease study estimated that 9 million deaths, premature deaths, were due to air pollution exposure in 2019, making it the fourth largest risk factor globally, and the top environmental health risk factor of all. So when you look at those numbers, you start putting things together, it's really tragic. So I think being able to tackle that saves lives. And to me, that's very important.
Yes. And where do you think we have the most to gain when it comes to tackling air pollution? Do we need more dedicated research to better understand the problem, or do policymakers need to act on the information that is already there?
Yeah, I'd say the thing we have to gain most is, like I mentioned before, saving lives. And at this point, I think there's enough research out there to show the impacts. And maybe we need more research on how we mitigate things. It becomes an incredibly complex issue when you take into account economic issues, local, cultural, and political things. So I think at this point, it really is on the policymakers to really step it up and find ways that we can do these interventions and maintain stability of society and economics as well.
Yeah, and would you say some of the policy needs to be focused towards sort of vehicles, or more towards the wildfires, for example, or what would you try to target first or want to change first?
Yeah, so I think it's regional. Certainly in areas where urban air pollution is still a big issue due to vehicles. I'm thinking of Beijing and Delhi. That's a place to focus on there. But in the Western United States, now the primary driver of air pollution are the wildfires. And so I think it depends on where you're at, what kind of interventions we have to do. So just recently, there was this fire in Canada that caused this massive transport of a plume to the eastern United States. And it's something that part of the United States doesn't experience very much. So there can be a lack of preparedness there if they're not expecting it.
Yeah. So if someone is interested in learning more about air pollution after this episode, and are there any resources you would suggest they check out to learn more about air pollution?
Yeah, so I'd say the Global Burden of Disease Study, they put out studies every few years. This is a really good one to look at. It's usually publicly available to kind of get a broad scope of the air pollution health effects and concentrations throughout the world. There are some really interesting websites that allow for people to do citizen science. The one I'm thinking of right now is called Purple Air. Go to purpleair.com. What this company does is they offer sort of low-cost air pollution sensors you can install in your home. And then that data goes into this global map of air pollution. And so even if you don't have one of those devices, you can pull up Purple Air and look at real-time air pollution concentrations throughout the world, wherever the sensors are. And it's even cooler because then you can pick a particular sensor or a group of sensor and download the data, from whatever time period that's available. And so you can look at the trends of air pollution at any time. So I think those are two really good resources if people are interested in this topic.
That
sounds very cool.
Yeah. No, indeed. And I'm just thinking like then you can really clearly see like the regional differences much better as well. Then, wow, fascinating.
Absolutely. Oh, and then diurnal differences, right? Like during the day and night. Those kind of things that
I imagine like vehicle output goes down at night then, and you notice that a lot with this data set.
Yeah, absolutely. And the chemistry changes too, because you don't have sunlight there. And so different chemical pathways dominate at night. So the chemistry doesn't stop. It's just, it goes different routes, which I think is pretty cool as a chemist.
Cool.
Yes.
Do you also see such big changes inside of houses?
Yeah. So indoor air pollution is another field that has picked up in the past couple decades. And I think, the COVID-19 pandemic was something that highlighted that. And to touch on that, one of the interesting things that have come out from the indoor air pollution studies is, people use chlorine-based or hydrogen peroxide-based cleaners. And there have been studies out there that show that, if you're using these cleaners and it's not well ventilated, maybe you have a window open, the sunlight's coming in, you can actually form particles in your home, organic particles with chlorine in it, which very, very toxic. So there are these things that I think maybe we think about less that, can have real impacts. And so, I think about all the times growing up, my mom was using copious amounts of bleach to clean the house, and it's just like, let's open a window,
Yeah.
It's definitely something we did with Corona as well.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for talking with us about this interesting topic. We really loved having you as a podcast guest. If people would like to find you or reach out to you, how can they best do that?
Oh, sure. So you can find me on Instagram, is where I mostly do my social interactions, mostly music, but I'm also trying to do some science communication through that. The handle there is @Gonzo Music Lab, Gonzo Music Laboratory.
Nice.
As well as my website, which I try to update as much as I can, which is at docgonzalez.weebly.com. And you can find more about my research there.
Cool. Okay, well, for our listeners, if you have any questions, suggestions, or comments, you can reach out to us via our website, thestrugglingscientist.com. You can also check out our website for some really cool science-inspired merch or to sign up for our awesome journal of the Struggling Scientist, aka our newsletter. And if you've enjoyed this episode, then leave us a rating on your favorite podcast listening platform, as it really helps us grow. You can also follow us on social media. Daron, which ones are those again?
Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and now YouTube.
Yes, definitely check out YouTube. We have video podcasts now. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to see you all again next time. Bye.
Bye.